She said it to me while the fire trucks were still on the lawn, smoke still pouring out of what used to be 30 years of my life's work. This is ash now, not your garage. My successful son called it an accident for 8 years. My failure son was the one who finally found out it wasn't. I'm 62 years old, and I want you to understand something before I tell you the rest of this. This isn't a story about a garage. It's a story about which one of your children believes the easy version of events, and which one keeps asking questions long after everybody else has decided it's easier to stop. Let me back up. I live outside Tulsa, Oklahoma, on 4 acres my father left me, in a house that's smaller now than it used to feel, back before half of what mattered to me stood 40 feet away in a building that isn't there anymore. I restored classic cars out of that garage for 31 years, starting with a rusted-out 1957 Bel Air I bought for $200 the summer I turned 19, working my way up through 3 decades of engines and body panels and late nights with a shop light clamped to a fender, until Holt's Restorations was a name people 2 states away had heard of. That garage wasn't a hobby. It was the only thing in my life, outside of my 2 sons, that I ever built entirely with my own 2 hands and never once had to explain the value of to anybody. It burned to the ground on a Thursday night in October, 8 years ago, 3 weeks into a divorce I hadn't wanted and Sandra had. Fire investigators ruled it faulty wiring within 4 days, closed the file within 2 weeks, and I stood in the ashes of that garage the following spring picking through what the fire hadn't taken, and every single person in my life told me it was a tragic accident, nothing more, the kind of thing that happens to old buildings with old wiring. Every single person except one. Welcome to Brian's revenge. If that opening's already got you sitting up straighter, that's exactly. Hit that like button, tell me where you're watching from, and stay with me, because it took 8 years for the truth about that fire to reach me, and when it finally did, it came from the last place I expected. Sandra and I had been married 34 years when the fire happened. High school sweethearts, the way people used to be able to say that and mean something real by it. We built a good life for a long stretch of those years. 2 boys, a business that grew slow and steady out of a garage I built with lumber I mostly couldn't afford at the time. Things started going sideways about 6 years before the divorce, in ways I understood only in pieces even now. Sandra wanted me to sell the restoration business and retire early, take the money and travel, and I wanted to keep working with my hands until my hands stopped letting me. And that disagreement, small at first, grew into something that ate through 34 years of marriage slower than I ever noticed happening until it was mostly gone. I remember the exact conversation that seemed to tip things. A Sunday afternoon about 5 years before the divorce, Sandra sitting across the kitchen table from me with a travel brochure for a river cruise through Europe, the kind of thing her sister had been doing since her own husband retired. "Jean, I want to see something before I'm too old to enjoy it," she said. "I want us to have a life that isn't just this garage." I remember telling her I understood, and meaning it, and then going back out to that garage the very next morning anyway, because some part of me genuinely didn't know how to be a person without motor oil under my fingernails and a half-finished restoration waiting on a lift. Looking back, I think that Sunday afternoon was the real beginning of the end, long before either of us used the word divorce out loud. Sandra started spending more time away from the house in those last few years: book club, a part-time job at a boutique in town, trips to see her sister that got longer each time. I told myself it was just a woman finding her own life after decades of raising 2 boys and keeping a household running around a husband who worked 6 days a week. I still believe that was mostly true. I also believe now, looking back with 8 more years of hindsight than I had then, that somewhere in those years she'd started keeping a kind of ledger of everything she felt she'd sacrificed for my garage, my business, my stubborn refusal to slow down, and that ledger had a balance she eventually decided needed settling. The divorce filing came 3 months before the fire. Standard enough on paper, the kind of split you'd expect after 3 decades together. The house, the retirement accounts, and one contested asset that the whole thing kept circling back to. A fully restored 1967 Shelby Mustang I'd spent 4 years bringing back from a rusted shell, worth, by the appraisal we'd both agreed to, somewhere north of $300,000. Sandra wanted half its value in the settlement. I wanted to keep the car itself, told her more than once over her attorney and mine that I'd sell everything else in that garage before I let that particular car go. I meant it as stubbornness, not as a threat. I understand now how it must have sounded to somebody who'd already decided I valued a piece of machinery more than I'd ever valued her. I remember the mediation session where that fight got its ugliest, 6 weeks before the fire, Sandra's voice cracking with something that sounded at the time like heartbreak and sounds, in memory now, like something closer to fury. "You'd rather lose everything than give me my half of that car, wouldn't you, Jean? That car matters more to you than I ever did." I didn't answer her that day. I sat there in that mediation room and said nothing, because some stubborn, wounded piece of me thought silence was the same thing as dignity. I've had 8 years since to wonder whether an honest answer that day might have changed anything at all about what happened 3 weeks later. I don't know that it would have. I know it's a question I still ask myself some nights. If you've made it this far, I want you to hold onto that detail about the Shelby, because it's going to matter a great deal by the end of this story, more than I understood myself for a very long time. The fire started around 11 at night, according to the initial report, in the electrical panel near the back workbench, the same panel I'd had inspected 18 months earlier and been told needed updating eventually. No rush. Eventually never came. I woke up to the smell of smoke and Sandra already standing in the driveway in her robe, and by the time the volunteer fire department made it out from town, there wasn't much left to save. The Shelby was gone. 31 years of tools, parts, half-finished projects, a lifetime's accumulation of exactly the kind of thing you can't rebuild with an insurance check, all of it gone by sunrise. I remember standing in that driveway watching the roof finally cave in, and I remember Sandra's voice beside me, flat and strange in a way I couldn't place at the time, grief-shocked, I told myself. "This is ash now, Jean. Not your garage anymore. Just ash." I thought standing there that it was the strangest possible way to comfort a man watching his life's work burn down. I didn't understand, not for 8 more years, that it wasn't comfort at all. It was something closer to satisfaction, dressed up as grief so nobody, including me, would look at it too closely. If this story's got a knot forming in your stomach already, that's exactly where I need you to be, because everything up to this point was just the setup for what my sons believed about that night, and what only one of them was ever willing to question. Marcus was 31 when the fire happened, already 2 years into a career as an insurance claims attorney in Oklahoma City. Ironically enough, the kind of job where he spent his working hours picking apart exactly the kind of investigation that had closed my case in 2 weeks flat. He drove out the weekend after the fire, walked the perimeter of the wreckage with his hands in his pockets, and told me, with the particular confidence of a man who deals in insurance findings for a living, that faulty wiring in a 30-year-old garage wasn't remotely suspicious, that these things happen, that I should be grateful nobody was hurt and focus on rebuilding, instead of looking for something darker in an ordinary tragedy. I remember that conversation clearly, standing in the ash with my son, both of us still in the clothes we'd worn to the funeral home the day before to arrange something entirely unrelated, a cousin's service that had already been scheduled before the fire happened. Marcus had his lawyer voice on the whole time, measured, reasonable, the voice he uses, I imagine, on clients whose claims he's about to explain away. "Dad, insurance investigators close cases fast because most fires really are exactly what they look like. You're grieving, and grief wants a villain. Sometimes there just isn't one. I remember wanting to believe him so badly that I let myself set the question down entirely for the better part of 8 years, mostly because it was easier than carrying it alongside everything else I'd already lost. Danny was 28 that year, worked as a mechanic at an independent shop off Highway 75, the son who'd spent every summer of his childhood underneath a car beside me in that garage, instead of at baseball camp like Marcus, the one Sandra used to describe, not always kindly, as the one who'd rather smell like motor oil than make something of himself the way his brother had. Danny didn't say much the day he came out to see the wreckage. He just stood there a long while, quiet, kicking at a piece of scorched sheet metal with the toe of his boot, and then asked me a question nobody else had thought to ask. "Dad, was the Shelby insured separately, or was it lumped in with the rest of the shop's coverage?" I didn't think much of the question at the time. I do now. That's the difference between my two sons, if you want it in one sentence before I go any further. Marcus accepted the official version because it was clean, professional, and didn't require him to consider that his own mother might have done something unforgivable. Danny never fully accepted it, not because he had proof of anything, but because he'd spent enough years watching his parents' marriage curdle up close to know that grief and satisfaction can sometimes wear the exact same expression on a person's face. The insurance payout came in low, much lower than the garage and its contents were actually worth, because I'd let the coverage lapse into an outdated policy 2 years earlier during a stretch when money was tight, and updating it kept sliding down the list. I got $60,000 for a business, a lifetime of tools, and a car worth more than 5 times that amount on its own. The divorce settlement finalized 4 months later, and because the Shelby no longer existed to divide, that particular fight simply evaporated, along with everything else that had been sitting in that garage. I want you to sit with that for a second, because I didn't fully sit with it myself for the better part of a decade. The one asset Sandra and I had fought hardest over in that divorce was also the one asset that happened to burn to nothing 3 weeks after she filed, in a fire that started in an electrical panel I'd been warned about 18 months earlier and never gotten around to fixing. I told myself for years that it was exactly the kind of grim coincidence that makes for a hard year, nothing more. I had no proof of anything else. I didn't want proof of anything else. Some part of me understood that having proof would mean I'd have to actually do something with it, and I wasn't sure back then that I had it in me. I spent the 2 years after the fire rebuilding slower than I'd ever built anything in my life, working a service department job at a dealership in town to keep the lights on, coming home most evenings too tired to do more than stare at the concrete slab where my garage used to stand. Danny showed up almost every weekend during those 2 years, sometimes with lumber he'd bought himself, sometimes just with 2 sandwiches and a 6-pack of the root beer I liked. And we framed that garage back up together one weekend at a time, board by board, the way you rebuild something you've genuinely lost rather than something you're just replacing. I remember one particular Saturday, about 8 months into the rebuild, a cold snap had come through and we were out there anyway, hands stiff around a nail gun, breath fogging in the unheated frame of what would eventually be walls again. Danny stopped at one point, looked around at the half-built structure, and said, almost to himself, "It's going to be better than the old one, Dad. We'll make sure of that." I don't know if he meant the building itself or something larger than the building, and I never asked, because I think some part of both of us understood the two things weren't fully separate anymore. Marcus visited twice in those 2 years. Sent money once, a check for $500 with a note that said, "Hope this helps. Dad, love, Marcus," which I appreciated and also understood, even at the time, as the kind of gesture a man makes when he's decided a problem belongs to somebody else's weekends instead of his own. If you're still with me, tell me in the comments which one of my sons you'd have wanted showing up on your weekends, because I promise you, the answer that matters most in this story is not the one that seemed obvious 8 years ago. My health started giving me trouble about 6 weeks ago. A persistent ache in my chest I kept blaming on the Oklahoma heat, and too many years of bending over engine blocks, until a stress test at the clinic came back concerning enough that Dr. Holloway sat me down instead of just handing me a printout. "Mr. Holt, you've got a significant blockage that needs addressing soon, not eventually. I want to schedule a procedure within the next 2 weeks." And then, the way these things always seem to go, a woman from billing named Carol told me my updated but still modest insurance had a coverage gap for the specific cardiac team Dr. Holloway wanted. $4,100 needed up front. I called Marcus first, the way you call the son who's got more, hoping some old, worn-down piece of me still believed a decade of distance hadn't fully hardened into something permanent. "Dad," he said, after I'd explained it, in the careful, measured tone he uses for clients he's about to deny a claim. "I hear you, but I've got to be honest. Things have been tight since Britt and I closed on the new house. Can you not put this on a payment plan through the hospital?" "I never asked you for anything after the fire, Marcus. Not once in 8 years. I know, and I appreciate that," he said, and something in the practiced smoothness of it made my chest tighter than the blockage itself. "But Dad, I've got my own family's finances to think about now. I can send something small, maybe, but 4,000 is a lot right now." I sat there in my truck a while after that call, thinking about a $500 check with a note that said, "Hope this helps, Dad," and how thoroughly that had apparently marked the outer edge of what my older son considered his obligation to a father who'd raised him, fed him, paid for a law degree out of a business that no longer existed. I thought about all the ways a person can be perfectly polite while making it clear exactly how little room you occupy in their life, and how Marcus had somehow mastered that particular skill without ever once raising his voice. I hung up understanding, in a way I hadn't quite let myself understand before, that whatever debt Marcus felt he owed his father had a ceiling on it, and I just found where that ceiling sat. I called Danny that same evening, ashamed in the particular way you get ashamed asking the son who has less, the one who spent 2 years of weekends helping you rebuild a garage instead of building his own life, for something his more comfortable brother had just turned down flat. "Dad, stop," he said, before I'd gotten more than a sentence out. "How much and by when?" "Danny, I can't ask you to. You're not asking." I heard him exhale slow on the other end of the line. "I've got about 1,800 put back from the Silverado job I finished last month. I'll figure out the rest. Give me till Friday, Danny. That money was for your own shop. You've been saving that for 3 years. The shop can wait, Dad." He said it like it was the simplest math in the world, the same steady way he'd said things his whole life. "It's not going anywhere. Neither are you if I've got anything to say about it. If you've stuck around for the CTA block and you're still here, that tells me something about you, and I think you're going to want to see what Danny did next, because it's the reason everything about that 8-year-old fire investigation was about to come apart. Welcome to Dad's Raw Revenge, and if you haven't already, hit that like button and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, because what happened over the following 3 weeks is the part neither of my sons saw coming, especially not the one who'd spent 8 years defending the official story. Danny didn't just come up with the $1,800. He took out a personal loan against the equipment in his own garage bay at the shop, the tools he used every single day to make his living, co-signed by his boss as a favor, to cover the rest of what I needed by that Friday. He never once told me the full extent of what he'd done until months later, when I finally pieced it together from an offhand comment his boss made at the shop. "That's who my son is. He mortgaged the tools he uses to feed himself so his father could have heart surgery, and never once made it sound like anything other than an ordinary Tuesday. The surgery went well. A single stent, clean recovery, and Danny drove me home himself and stayed the first 2 nights on my couch, same as he had after the fire 8 years earlier, checking on me at odd hours like he still didn't trust the rest of the world to do it for him. It was during that second night, both of us up late because neither of us could sleep, that he finally told me something he'd apparently been sitting on for the better part of a year. "Dad," he said, quiet, staring at the television without really watching it. "You remember I dated a girl named Renata for a while, couple years back," I remembered vaguely. "Go on." "She works at the county fire marshal's office now, records department. They've been digitizing old case files, going back 20, 30 years, and she mentioned something to me a while back, almost in passing, about a case from our county that got flagged during the digitization process. Anomalies in the original electrical inspection, photos versus what got written up in the final report. I didn't think much of it until she said the address out loud a few weeks ago. Dad, it was ours." I sat very still on that couch, the same stubborn, disbelieving stillness I remembered from the morning after the fire itself. "What kind of anomalies?" I asked. "The panel photos from the scene don't match the damage pattern described in the report," Danny said. "Renata says it happens sometimes. An investigator under time pressure writes up a plausible explanation without fully accounting for everything in the evidence photos. She said, off the record, that the burn pattern in the photos looks more consistent with an accelerant near the base of the workbench than with a panel failure. She's not an investigator herself. She just processes records, but she's seen enough of them to know what doesn't sit right. I want you to understand what it felt like, sitting on my own couch 8 years after watching my life's work turn to ash, hearing my younger son, the one everybody in this family had spent a decade quietly underestimating, hand me the first real thread of proof that the night I'd spent 8 years telling myself was just terrible luck might have been something else entirely. I didn't sleep at all that night. I lay awake thinking about Sandra's voice in that driveway. "This is ash now, Gene, not your garage anymore," and the strange flatness underneath it that I'd spent 8 years explaining away as shock. I thought too about all the small things I'd noticed in the months after the fire and talked myself out of caring about. How quickly Sandra had stopped asking about the insurance claim once it's settled. How she'd never once come out to see the framing going up during those 2 years of rebuilding. How the divorce had finalized without a single further word about the Shelby, as though the subject had simply ceased to exist for her the moment the car did. If this story's got you leaning forward, that's exactly where you should be, because what I found over the following 3 weeks changed not just what I understood about that fire, but what I was about to do with the rest of my life because of it. I called Renata myself 2 days later, with Danny's permission, and she was careful, professional, unwilling to speculate beyond what the photos actually showed. But she agreed to let me file a formal request to reopen the case given the digitization discrepancy, a request that, as a private citizen with a direct interest in the original finding, I was entitled to make. The county fire marshal's office assigned a senior investigator named Boyd Castellan to review the file fresh, and 6 weeks later, working from the same photographs that had sat untouched in a records room for 8 years, he reached a very different conclusion than the one that had closed my case in 2 weeks flat back, when I was too shattered to ask a single hard question. I met Boyd in person twice during that 6 weeks, once at the records office and once out at the property itself, walking the same concrete slab Danny and I had rebuilt on top of 8 years earlier. He was a careful man, unwilling to overstate anything, but I could see in the way he studied those old photographs, holding them up against the newer forensic imaging his office had run, that he'd already reached a conclusion long before he was ready to say it to me out loud. Boyd told me, sitting across from me in a small conference room at the fire marshal's office, the original investigation was rushed and, frankly, deficient. The burn pattern and residue testing we've now been able to run on the archived samples are consistent with an ignitable liquid accelerant, not an electrical fault. Someone started that fire deliberately. I sat there in that conference room and felt something I hadn't felt in 8 years, not grief exactly, something colder and clearer than that. "Do you know who?" I asked. "We can't prove intent from physical evidence alone," Boyd said. "But there's something else you should know. Your ex-wife's name came up during our review of the original case file. A neighbor gave a statement the night of the fire that never made it into the final report, mentioning that she'd seen a car matching your ex-wife's leaving the property around 10:40 that night, roughly 20 minutes before the fire was reported. That statement got filed and never followed up on, because the case closed as accidental before anybody thought it mattered. I want you to sit with that detail the way I had to sit with it, alone in my truck in that parking lot for the better part of an hour before I could make myself drive home. Sandra had been on the property 20 minutes before the fire started, on a night she'd told me, and everyone else she'd spent the whole evening at her sister's. That's the moment something in me went quiet and cold and very, very clear. I didn't call Marcus. I didn't call Sandra. I want you to remember that because it matters for what comes later. I never went looking for this. I simply stopped accepting, once real evidence existed, a story that had cost me a business, a lifetime of work, and 8 years of believing my own worst instincts about that night were unfair to a woman I'd once loved. I called an attorney instead, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Priya Nair, who specialized in exactly this kind of overlap between old insurance claims and newly reopened criminal findings. Priya, it's Jean Holt. I need you to look at something. A fire marshal's office just reclassified an 8-year-old fire at my property from accidental to suspected arson. I need to understand what that means for the divorce settlement that closed 4 months after that fire, and for the insurance claim that paid out on it. She called me back 3 days later, after pulling the original divorce decree and the closed insurance file. Jean, this is significant. Your divorce settlement included a standard but rarely triggered clause, one your own attorney included at the time almost as boilerplate, stating that if either party is later found, through legal or investigative process, to have destroyed marital property through fraud or deliberate misconduct in a manner that materially affected the settlement's asset division, the wronged party may petition to reopen the settlement and seek damages from the offending party's post-divorce assets, up to the documented value of what was destroyed. Given the Shelby's appraised value and the arson finding, you have a very strong claim here, Jean. We're talking about damages that could reach well past the car's original $300,000 valuation, once you factor in the underpaid insurance claim and 8 years of lost restoration income tied to that garage closure. I sat there in my truck outside Priya's office a long while, thinking about a garage rebuilt one weekend at a time by a son everyone in this family had quietly decided wasn't going to amount to much, and a fire marshal's records room where the truth had sat waiting 8 years for somebody to care enough to ask the right question. Priya, I want to move on this quietly. I don't want a single soul outside this call knowing until it's filed, not even your sons, especially not. I thought about $1,800 borrowed against a mechanic's own tools, about 2 years of weekends spent framing a building back up board by board. Draw up whatever needs drawing up. Whatever comes from this claim, I want it going into a trust. Irrevocable. Sole beneficiary, Danny Holt. Enough to buy that shop bay outright, clear whatever loan he took out to cover my surgery, and set him up with his own place the way he's been wanting for 3 years now. Priya didn't say anything for a second. All of it, Jean. Whatever the claim yields, after my legal costs and a reserve for my own care, every dollar, yes. He mortgaged his own tools to save my life, Priya. Spent 2 years of weekends rebuilding something his mother tried to burn out of my life entirely. Meanwhile, my other son told me things had been tight since he closed on his new house. So no, I'm not splitting whatever comes from this evenly for the sake of looking fair. Fair already happened, Priya, over 2 years of Saturdays with lumber and root beer, and only one of my sons was ever actually there for it. I hear you, Jean. I'll have the petition filed within the month. I hung up the phone and sat there a long while in that parking lot, thinking about a driveway 8 years ago and a sentence I'd spent nearly a decade misunderstanding. This is Ash now, Jean. Not your garage anymore. They're going to find out eventually, I thought. And when they do, they're not going to ask how my heart's healing. They're going to ask about money and about a fire marshal's file that should have been read correctly the first time and wasn't. I wasn't wrong about that part. I want you to hold on to that thought because it's exactly what happened, but not the way I expected, and not for the reason I expected. If you've stuck with this story all the way through, that tells me something about the kind of person you are, and I think you're going to want to see how Marcus finds out. Because he doesn't find out from me. He finds out the way I always suspected he would, through his own professional instincts, chasing a case file that was about to become very personal. 5 weeks after that call with Priya, my phone rang at 9 in the evening. Marcus's name on the screen for the first time since he'd told me things had been tight since closing on his new house. Dad. His voice had an edge I hadn't heard from him in years. I need you to explain something to me. A case came across my desk today, unrelated matter, but the fire marshal's office in your county reclassified an old case as arson. And Dad, it's got our old address on it. So that's how it happened, I thought. Not from me. From his own job, his own careful professional habits, tripping over a file with his childhood address printed right there on the cover page. I found out about the reclassification 5 weeks ago, Marcus, I said, steady. Filed a claim to reopen the divorce settlement based on it 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks, and you didn't call me, your own son, a lawyer, about something this significant. Last time I called you about something significant, Marcus, you told me things had been tight since you closed on your new house. So no, calling you wasn't the first thing on my mind. There was a long silence on the line, longer than I expected from a man who deals in silence for a living. 20 minutes later, headlights swept across my driveway. Marcus's car, and behind it, one I hadn't seen in 8 years, Sandra's. That's where I'm going to leave this for now. Because what I told them both, standing in the same driveway where I once heard the words, "This is Ash now, not your garage anymore," and what a fire marshal's overlooked photograph had already decided about that night 8 years before either of them was ready to hear it. That's a conversation that changed everything about which version of that fire this family was finally going to have to live with. Marcus got out of his car first, still in his work clothes. Tie loosened the way I imagine it gets loosened on his worst days at the office, and Sandra came around the other side slower, her arms already crossed the way I remembered them crossing during those last ugly months of our marriage. "Dad, what is this?" Marcus said, standing at the edge of the driveway like he wasn't sure yet whether he was here to defend his mother or actually hear me out. "An arson finding. 8. You have any idea what kind of claim you're threatening to file?" "I know exactly what kind of claim I'm filing, Marcus," I said, steady. "I've had a fire marshal's office confirm what your brother's instincts told him the very week it happened, when you were out here telling me faulty wiring wasn't remotely suspicious." Sandra hadn't said a word yet, standing a few feet back from Marcus, and something in her stillness told me more than anything either of them was about to say out. "Sandra," I said, turning to her directly for the first time, "a neighbor gave a statement the night of the fire. Saw your car leaving this property around 10:40, 20 minutes before the fire got reported. You told everyone, told me, that you were at your sister's the whole evening." Her arms tightened further across her chest, and for a long moment she didn't answer at all, which told both her sons everything they needed to know before she ever opened her mouth. "That statement doesn't prove anything, Jean," she finally said, her voice thinner than I remembered it, some of the old fire gone out of it entirely. "People misremember things. It was dark, it was chaotic, that neighbor could have seen anybody's car, could have," I agreed. "Except the investigator also found accelerant residue near the workbench, Sandra. Not wiring failure. Something poured." Marcus turned to look at his mother then, really look at her, the way I imagine he looks at a witness whose story has just started to come apart under cross-examination, and I watched something shift across his face that I hadn't seen from him in years, something closer to the boy he used to be before he learned to keep his expression so carefully composed. "Mom, is that true? Did you do something to the garage?" Sandra didn't answer him right away. When she finally spoke, her voice had lost almost all its earlier certainty. "You don't understand what those years were like, Marcus. Your father chose that garage over me, over us, for longer than either of you know. I never meant for it to burn everything. I only meant to damage the workbench area, make a point. I didn't think it would take the whole building. The silence that followed lasted longer than any silence I could remember in that driveway, longer than the one the night the roof caved in, longer than the one after Dr. Holloway told me about the blockage in my heart. Marcus stood very still, some old, comfortable understanding of his own mother clearly coming apart in real time. Right there on the gravel where he'd once told me faulty wiring wasn't remotely suspicious. "You knew," Marcus finally said, turning back to me, something raw in his voice now. "You've suspected this for years, haven't you? And you never said anything to me." "I suspected it," I said. "I didn't have proof, and I didn't want to spend years accusing your mother of something I couldn't back up. Your brother is the one who kept asking questions nobody else wanted to ask." Renata in the records department, the reopened file, all of it started with Danny refusing to just accept the easy version the way the rest of us did. Marcus looked past me then, toward the house, where Danny had come to stand in the doorway, quiet, the way he'd been quiet in that driveway 8 years earlier kicking at a piece of scorched sheet metal. "You knew this whole time it wasn't an accident," Marcus said to his brother, something between accusation and genuine wonder in it. "I didn't know," Danny said, calm, the same steady tone he'd used on the phone about the $1,800. "I just never stopped wondering. There's a difference." Sandra found her voice again, sharper now, closer to fear than anger. "What are you going to do with this, Jean?" "A petition, damages, is that really necessary after everything?" "I already did something with it," I said. "Filed the petition 3 weeks ago. It's moving forward regardless of what happens in this driveway tonight." "Filed it how?" Marcus asked, his lawyer instincts apparently reasserting themselves even in the middle of watching his own family come apart. "What are you asking for?" "I want you both to understand something first," I said, "because what I'm about to tell you touches a clause your own mother's attorney wrote into our divorce settlement, boilerplate at the time, that neither of you would have thought twice about. And I think, once you hear it, you're going to understand exactly why none of what comes from this claim was ever going to be something either of you could argue about." Sandra's arms stayed crossed, but something underneath the certainty in her face had already started, quietly, to crack. The same way it had cracked 8 years ago in a driveway full of smoke, except this time there was no fire left to hide behind. Stay with me. Part 2 picks up exactly where this one stops, standing in that same driveway, and it does not go the way either of them expected.